I first arrived in Afghanistan after the attacks of September 11th to cover a war involving some of the world's greatest powers, one that's still having a devastating impact on the ordinary people who live here. Over the years, I'd returned to Afghanistan again and again, but there was one story, one person I'll always remember. This is Asadullah Rahman. When I first met him, he'd just returned from Guantanamo Bay.
The kind of people held at Guantanamo include terrorist trainers, extremist recruiters and finance bodyguards of Osama bin Laden, would-be suicide bombers. They're not common car thieves. They're believed to be determined killers.
But Asadullah, he was just a child. Just 10 years old when he was arrested, the youngest to have ever served time in this prison camp built for those America deemed hardcore terrorists. People were tortured, waterboarded, conditions so appalling many committed suicide.
These are military prisons. They're for big people. They're for soldiers. They didn't belong in Guantanamo Bay. We're not in the business of detaining children.
I was the first to track down Asadullah after his release, the first to get his story. How did such a young boy end up in Guantanamo Bay? What did the United States actually want from him? And why did they keep him here for so long?
I cannot answer why they were there that long, except that knowing that if they were returned, they could end up back on the battlefield and end up being killed.
There's no way that these kids know anything of any importance, and to mastermind a significant threat to anyone was probably fairly unlikely.
10 years later, I've returned to Afghanistan to find out what happened to that child, now a young man. Had he joined the Taliban like so many others his age? How did his past shape his present life, a life that offers so few choices? What's become of Asadullah after growing up in Guantanamo? This is Dar al-Aman Palace, the House of Peace in Kabul. Built in the 1920s by the former king, it was supposed to be a symbol of progress, the site of a new parliament, a new capital city. But today, it's a testament to war. Endless violence that's engulfed this country for more than 30 years. Walking through all of this destruction, you're still reminded of Afghanistan's rich past, of the grandeur and the glory. But of course, you're also reminded of the violence, the terrible violence that this generation of Afghans has experienced their entire lives. Somehow, Afghanistan survived. The Soviet occupation, the Taliban, the American-led invasion. But this palace wasn't destroyed by foreign forces. It was reduced to ruins by Afghans themselves. Infighting between powerful warlords. After nearly 15 years, almost all foreign troops have finally pulled out of Afghanistan. But this country's still caught up in a violent civil war between the Western-backed government and Islamist insurgents. In some ways, the violence is even worse now than when I first came here in 2003, when the American military forced the Taliban into retreat. I was a journalist writing for a Canadian newspaper. One night in Kabul, I saw a news clip about 3 prisoners being flown back to Afghanistan from Guantanamo Bay. But when I saw them being led from the helicopter in shackles and orange jumpsuits, I realized these prisoners were not men. They were boys, no more than 13 or 14 years old. Nobody could tell me where they were, but my fixer heard a rumor that the youngest was from a remote village about a 4-hour drive from Kabul. We decided to go there to try to find him. The village was nothing more than a few mud huts, no electricity, no running water, no phones. Nobody spoke any English. At first, people thought we were American spies. Then a young boy came outside, shook my hand, and introduced himself. I still remember that day so clearly. When Asadullah came out, he spoke to me in perfect English, and I was so shocked that such a young boy had been to Guantanamo Bay. But even more surprising in some ways that the experience had actually been a positive one for him. He had learned English and math, and he knew how to play chess. And he knew there were dinosaurs, that the world was round. Nobody else in his village knew any of that. When I left, the last thing he told me was that he wanted to become a doctor, and I remember his biggest dream at the time was to go to America. He saw no future for himself back in his village. He was proud of what he'd learned in prison, but unable to continue his education. His American teachers had offered him a glimpse beyond the poverty and misery of his life in Afghanistan. When my story about Asadullah broke, it was the first time anyone had heard from a child that had been imprisoned and interrogated in Guantanamo. Other journalists from around the world came to interview him, stunned by his ordeal. The press made Asadullah into a local celebrity. He was like no one else in his village.
In Guantanamo.
Guantanamo?
Yes. Cuba.
Cuba.
But it also brought him to the attention of the Taliban. Not long after, I lost touch with him. The constant fighting made it impossible to travel back to his village. I worried he'd been killed. But even after so long, there had to be a way to find out whatever happened to Asadullah. I called an old friend in Kabul who I'd worked with before.
When you first called me to find this guy, I thought you were completely out of your mind, because it is almost impossible to pluck a single individual out of the maelstrom of violence that is southern and eastern Afghanistan. Plus I think you only had a first name, which is sort of like looking for some guy named John in New York City. It's just it was a really tall order.
Luckily, Graeme had contacts in Asadullah's village. It turned out he'd left years ago. I heard he'd ended up in Kabul, and through another contact, I asked to meet with him. I had no idea whether he'd remember me, or even whether he'd want to meet me again after so many years. So the last time I met Asadullah, he was 12 or 13 years old, and he was in his village, which was very remote, and he was surrounded by his friends and his family. And now I'm about to meet him again here in Kabul, where there's lots of traffic and lots of people. This is the first time I'll have seen him in more than 10 years. Had he changed? The child I knew was friendly, sweet. But the last 10 years, this has become a different country. Just my first week back, there were 2 suicide bombings in Kabul. Westerners kidnapped in the middle of the day, right off the street. So many of these problems blamed on the West. How would Asadullah see me? As an old friend or part of the problem? I thought it would be best to meet at a cafe, where people are searched for weapons before they walk through the door. Thankfully, it was like no time had passed. I wouldn't have recognized you with your beard. You look very different, your beard and your face. It's been a long time.
10 years ago.
Yeah. One of the first things I realized is that he'd lost nearly all of his English. You were the only one who spoke English. So when I came and I said, I'm looking for a boy named Asadullah, you came out and you said, hello, madam, nice to meet you, my name is Asadullah, in perfect English.
هغه مې ټول په یاد دي سیاته راغلی د موږ کره یو موټر و در سره واورسوی وه د ما عکسونه دي د جماعت په بام باندې سې ونیولو لاندې د نینې کور کې کوټه کې کوم تحقیق دي چې کله ټول مې په یاد دي.
When he moved to Kabul about 6 years ago, Asadullah found work as a day laborer in a shop here selling nuts and dried fruit. He earns barely enough to get by.
نه سواد هم درلوده نه هم تعلیم وکړو بس بې تربیه لوی سولو نور خو چا هم پوښتنه ونه کړله بس دغسې پاتې سو لاتیم کراچیواني کوله بس دغه د کراچۍ کار هم کوه دغه د ظلم کار نور چینان له هغه وخته نه هسې تقریبا ډېر کم عمر مې و تر اوسه پورې هغلته مې مزدوري کولو استخان کې لګیا مو اوس هغلته مې
I asked about his family. He told me he'd gotten married about 8 months earlier and his wife was expecting a baby.
واده مې ښه واده وکړ په خپل زړه مې وکړ خو داسې واده مې وکړ قسم په خدای په داسې وامردار مې کړی داسې پوښتنه یې وکړې له بل چا نه عین لکه ډېر یو خفګان واده مې ښه واده وکړ خو خوند یې نه کوه ځکه په هغې د موږ په جي کې وضعیت ډېر خراب ده نو واده مې وکړ دلته مې راوړ ښه یم بد نه یم ګزاره کومه بس
He told me he and his wife left their village because there was no work. But I sensed there was more to the story. In fact, he'd been shot at, kidnapped. The Taliban had tortured him at knife point. That's why he left. He didn't want to talk much about it, but his friend Sahak told me this wasn't random violence.
دته ډیر مشکلات خلق شول طالبان له خوا دته ډیر سخت مشکلات حتی دا یو وایسته باید موږ سره یو ځای سي د امریکایانو په ضد په دې ستا سره یې وای ظلم کړی خو ده به ویل چې نه زه نه کوم نور دې سیاست و هغه نه لرې ګرځم زه خپل ژوند کوم عادي حالت
Asadullah is haunted by his past. Being imprisoned in Guantanamo has put his life at risk in Afghanistan. He told me he feels abandoned by the Americans. He blames the US for his problems and feels forgotten.
ما له ځان سره سوچ وکړم هلسې یو ژورنالست ده چې د ما پوښتنه کوي او د ما ته وایي چې تا سره یا زیاتی وسي یا څرنګه دی چې ځان ته په دنیا باندې حاکم وایي حقوق بشر وایي دی دا پوښتنه ونه کړه چې موږ دې سره ظلم وکړو یا زیاتی وکړو نو خامخا یو سړي ته زور ورکوي احساس یې پورته کوي که نه له ما سره ډېر زیاتی وسه په دومره عمر کم عمر کې دومره ظلم ډېر غټ زیاتی ده خو بیا ما یې په تر اوسه په عکس العمل کې څه ونه کړله
As a journalist, you soon realize Afghanistan's a country full of stories of endless injustice. Asadullah's story was almost unimaginable. But the boy I met in that village also embodied what I came to admire about this country and its people. He was a survivor. Against all odds, he would find a way to make a life for himself. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. He was born to a family of poor farmers. At the age of 10, his uncle found him work for a local warlord. He cooked and cleaned for the commander's men. He was also sexually abused by them. It was 2002, the height of the invasion. Coalition soldiers were on the hunt for Osama bin Laden and Taliban fighters. That October, American special forces raided the warlord's compound, and Asadullah was swept up in the chaos. Do you have any memories of the raid?
مازدیګر ټیم و تقریبا ماسپښین مازدیګر ټیم چې دی راغلله دننې دغلته راغلله بس چاردیګر منطقه یې محاصره کړله ډزونه مزونه هېڅ شی هم نه دي کړي بس نیپایر وکړه بس راغله راننوتله ټولې ونیولو زه دغلته ناست وم اتیزم له ځان سره کته کړم و امریکایان و ملي اردو دغه کمپاین والا و
Asadullah was in American military custody. His family had no idea. His mother and father spent months, thousands of dollars, searching for him across the country. It was all in vain. Like so many other poor Afghans caught up in this war, they had suffered an inconceivable loss. They were left with no answers, no help. It felt as though Asadullah had simply vanished. In fact, he was being held at Gardez, an American military base in Afghanistan near the Pakistani border. He was interrogated and even beaten.
زخمونه زه اوس هم په ځان کې لرم او اوس هم هغه درد کوي هغلته پوځیان ویلې چې پلانه یې پېژنې عکسونه به یې موږ ته راوړه داسې عکسونه به یې راوړل چې موږ به پېژندم نه موږ ډېر سختې لوږې تندې تېرې کړې اگر که ما دوی ته ډېر ورته ویلې چې ما خو نه څه جرم کړی دی د ما عمر د ما وخت او دا ساعت ما خو څه شی نه دی کړی دی موږ ته ویلې ته موږ ته پلانې او پلانې طالبان راوښیې قومندانان راوښیې ما ورته ویلې زه یو هم نه پېژنم زه خو یوه مسایه دلته راغلی یم له لوګر نه راغلی یم زه څوک نه پیژنم. بس دی ما باندې دغه تاکید کاوه چې ته دا خبرې موږ ته وکړه موږ دې پرېږدو. هغه نو ماته څه معلومات نه وه.
Then he was transferred here to Bagram, a U.S. airbase near Kabul, for even more questioning. Once you arrived at Bagram, what questions were you asked and how were you treated?
بګرام کې یې کښته کړلو، هغلته یې لاسونه او پښې تړلي وو، هلته یې واچولو. بس په کوټه کې پراته وو. بعد له هغه نه اتې د موږ نه کمیسونه پر هغه کالي ټول وایستله، اتې لوڅ لغړ به یې درولي او موږ ته به یو امریکنی په زوره زوره غږېده. بیا بعد له هغه به یې موږ ته وروسته سره کالي راواغوسته، په ځان به یې کړه.
Bagram was notorious for prisoner abuse. And Asadullah wasn't the only child there. Adnan Khan, another prisoner, was there at the same time. He remembers Asadullah and 2 other boys.
دوی هلته چې ما ولیدل انفرادي وطاق کې و چې دوی به کله تشناب ته راوستل، هلته په وطاق کې تشنابونه نه وو. نو ما به لیدلې دوی پښې کې زولانې، حتی کې چې دا زولانې دوی پښو کې ازادې وې، ترې وتلې به لاسونو نه. او څه وخته به بیا وروسته 2 عسکرو دوی نیولې وو، ځکه زولانې دوی په لاسونو کې نه برابرېدې، دومره کشران 2 عسکرو، هغه به ډېر غټ عسکرو نیولې وو. ما به تعجب کوو چې دا دومره تپل ماشوم او 2-3 عسکر دې سره سکیورټي چې دوی تشناب ته وړي، دا تعجب خبره.
A former American commander at Bagram also remembers Asadullah. He didn't want to go on camera, but in an email, he told me his soldiers realized his prisoners were children.
Some of my soldiers gave them small toys like Legos to play with. We also gave them coloring books and crayons. The kids told my troops they were chai boys, held as servants and for sexual pleasure of some Afghan tribal chiefs.
Asadullah was in prison with 2 other boys, Nakibullah, about 13 years old, and Ismail Aga, 15.
The U.S. likely figured that the kids were in a no-win situation. The kids might not know some of the Taliban or Al-Qaeda leaders, but if we let them go, they would likely be recruited or forced to join. We were likely treading in unfamiliar territory, and we weren't sure how to proceed.
Amazingly, the Americans decided they had only one option.
So we just took them to Gitmo. We perhaps thought we could help them see the U.S. in a new light and alter their future decisions.
In January 2003, Asadullah got some unexpected news. He'd be leaving Bagram.
یو ورځ بس عسکر راغی، ولې راوټکاوه، وایي کمین. چې ورته راغلم، بس لاسونه یې راولچه کړه، ته یې بوتلم. یوه جینکۍ به په پارسي ژبه باندې، دري ژبه به یې خبرې کولې. له هغه سره هلته ولاړم، اتې له هغه سره کېناستم، خبرې مې ورسره وکړلې. اتې وروسته ماته راته ویلې چې هر شی یې راکړو، جوس موس چې میوه یې ریګ راکړله. اتې ماته وروسته راته ویلې وایي تا موږ ګوانتانامو ته ولو.
Asadullah was terrified, and so were the rest of the prisoners.
ټول ناست دي، اکثره زاړي، اکثره تلاوت کوي. نو ما خپله ډېر سخت زیات وځړله. نو کله یې چې کالي را بدلولو چې بوتلمه، هغلته عسکرو له ما سره ډېر سخت بد چلند کوو. چا به مې ویښتان کموله د سر، هغه به یې په خوله رامنډله، چا به څه راسره کول، چا څه. اگر که زه ډېر کم عمر و، خوا ډېره سخته د دردونکې کیسه ده چې سړی یې اوري بیخي.
The military prison at Guantanamo Bay was built in 2002 on a U.S. naval base in Cuba, a place to detain those America deemed its most dangerous enemies, where they could be interrogated and prosecuted for war crimes. When Asadullah landed here, he joined about 600 other detainees at Camp Delta. Reports had already surfaced of prisoner abuse, sleep deprivation, psychological torture, humiliation, and beatings.
بس نارنجي کالي یې راواغوستل، ولچه کې 2 په لاسو کې راواچولې، په پښو کې، په ملا پورې دومره زنځیرونه راوتړلې، لا مړی سوی. بس ماشوم مو نو ډېر سخت ارمان ده.
The flight from Kabul to Cuba was not just a journey from one world to another. It was one that would change Asadullah's life forever. When the plane touched down in Cuba, Asadullah expected the worst.
په موټر کې کېنولم، اتې راته ویل وایي کېنې که څملې. ما ورته ویلې نه، هغه نو څملمه چې څملستمه د ما سترګې چې کله لوڅې کړلې زه ډېر سخت لړزېدم دومره سخت رېږدېدم سخت وېرېدم.
From now on, he no longer had a name, just a number.
اتې ما ته یې راته ویلې 912 اوسه پورې مې په زړه کې ده 912 my name. نو ته بس غږ یې وکړه 912 اتې زه راجګ شوم چې زه وایي ځې جګ کړمه ځې جګ کړمه پوځیانو د باندې راوایستلم سپو یې غپله زه سخت وډار شوم. ما ویلې مالدا خو لکه چې رښتیا دلته ډېر دهشت ده.
At the time, Guantanamo Bay was a gray zone, a tiny corner of Cuba where the United States claimed the Geneva Conventions to protect prisoners of war didn't apply. It said these weren't POWs. These were terrorists. At first, American authorities refused to admit they had children at Guantanamo. Then, reporters started asking questions.
Despite their age, these are very, very dangerous people. Some have killed, some have stated they're going to kill again. So they may be juveniles, but they're not on a little league team anywhere. They're on a major league team, and it's a terrorist team. And they're in Guantanamo for very good reason, for our safety, for your safety.
There are a lot of concerns about having children at Guantanamo. For one thing, if they're there as so-called, enemy combatants, it means that they're actually child soldiers. And so the imperative under international law is for rehabilitation of these children, not punishment. There are obligations that are binding on the United States, both in terms of treatment of children generally, who are in detention, as well as how you treat child soldiers in particular. And the U.S. violated all of these obligations.
It had been 6 months since Asadullah had vanished from Afghanistan. 6 months since his family had heard from him. They were certain he was dead.
بیا چې کله د ده خط راغی موږ پوه شولو چې دی په ګوانتانامو کې ده او دا هم ډېره بده خبره وه زموږ لپاره. ګوانتانامو نوم موږ لومړي ځل واورېدو چې ګوانتانامو ته یو داسې ماشوم هغه زموږ نه یو دم ورک سوی بېچاره چې هېڅ کار یې نه و کړی هېڅ جرم مرتکب سوی نه و او دا بیا ان ګوانتانامو ته رسېدله. دا ډېره د حیرانتیا خبره وه او خصوصا ټول کلی په دې خفه و په دې ډېر وړکی ماشوم و.
Just what happened at Guantanamo Bay? Did they hurt or help him? I would have to travel halfway around the world to get these answers from the person who knew him best at Guantanamo. He's someone Asadullah had told me about, but whose name he never knew. I'd have to convince that person to tell me exactly what happened.
I haven't spoken about it because I didn't feel that it was an event in my life that I'm particularly proud of. I did what I thought was right for the situation I was in.
In early 2003, Asadullah Rahman, the youngest prisoner of America's war on terror, arrived at Guantanamo Bay. Until then, this prison camp housed only adults. More than 600 people America described as hardcore terrorists. But military commanders faced an urgent question. What should they do with Asadullah and 2 other boys who'd just arrived? Since I first met Asadullah in 2004, I've tried to understand how he could come to terms with what happened to him as a child. And also, if anyone could help me understand why he was put through such an ordeal. Halfway around the world from Cuba's Guantanamo Bay, on another island in the middle of the Western Pacific, there's another American naval base. I've come here, to Guam, to meet the only person who can really answer questions about what happened after 3 children arrived in Guantanamo Bay. The one who really got to know Asadullah while he was in prison. I'm on my way to meet David Austin, who's going to tell me more about what he remembers about Asadullah. This is the first time he's ever spoken about any of this. David Austin was 31 years old, fresh out of medical school. 3 months into his assignment at Guantanamo, his commanders made an unusual request.
I was brought in to be told that I needed to prepare for potentially having some juveniles come. My first response was, they shouldn't come. And then I was told that I still needed to come up with a plan. So then I added a bunch of other things that I just thought of off the top of my head in hopes that the requests were so over the top and would cost millions and millions of dollars that they would say, well, we can't do that, and would end up sending them back anyway. But when I turned in my requests, I was told, thank you very much. And I said, well, do you think they're going to do this? And they said, we have a blank check. We will do what needs to be done.
Military commanders had to decide what to do with the boys. They agreed to most of David Austin's demands.
The important ones were that they would never be in the adult camp, Camp Delta, that they would need their own camp built, that they would have to have outside facilities, that they would have to have 3 meals a day, warm meals, halal prepared meals, that they would have teachers, that they would have a curriculum, that they would have their own individual living areas. So things that nobody else on the island had or would ever consider.
When Asadullah got off the plane, still blindfolded, he was put onto a truck. He had no idea where he was going or what would happen to him.
I remember them taking their blindfolds off and obviously being, disoriented and quiet, not making eye contact as I would expect, and they didn't speak.
Asadullah wasn't placed with the rest of the prisoners. He was brought here to Camp Iguana, a small house looking directly onto the sea, totally separate from the main prison.
My goal was to hope that they would feel that the location where they were, that they at some point would start to feel safe, that they would know that nothing bad was going to happen during their stay, and that in that safe area that eventually they would emerge as far as being able to communicate.
Those years weren't just lonely for Asadullah, they shaped the rest of his life. On one hand, he's grateful for the kindness people like Austin showed, but he's also bitter that he was torn from his family at such a young age. I can see in his eyes that he's still so haunted, still struggling to make sense of what the Americans did and why. I've come to the U.S. to ask people about the child prisoners of Guantanamo Bay, to meet some of those who worked there. There are still so many questions about Camp Iguana. One of the first journalists to visit was Ted Conover, then writing for the New York Times. He was on a routine media tour of Guantanamo Bay when the military said something shocking.
When we got there, we were told that Camp Iguana was a special space for juvenile enemy combatants. When we were very surprised because none of us had ever heard that there were juveniles, that there were minors at Guantanamo. As far as I know, it had not been made public before that morning.
What was your reaction to the fact that children were being held in Camp Iguana?
I was astonished because Guantanamo had at that point received a lot of publicity. I'm still kind of shocked about it because they were quite young, and you wonder how they made it through the process and ended up at Guantanamo because the process usually involved internment at a facility in Afghanistan, right? And these are military prisons. They're for big people. They're for soldiers. And they implied that the kids had been soldiers. And yet they also implied that they weren't culpable in the way that the grown-up soldiers were. So it just raised all these questions, which unfortunately they wouldn't answer.
The boys at Camp Iguana were comfortable. They slept in single beds in 2 small rooms. There was a kitchen, windows, a beach where they could kick a ball around.
There was a display of games, including something called Pop-O-Matic Trouble, with a clear plastic hemisphere you push on and dice move around. And then there was a VCR, and one of the films which struck me was Castaway with Tom Hanks, which I thought was quite a fascinating choice.
None of it was an accident. Everything, right down to the color of paint on the walls, was the result of military orders.
I did tend to bring things when I would do my visits to try to deflect any type of theory that I would be asking them anything or interrogating them in any way. So I would bring footballs, soccer balls, we would play chess, any type of activity, that was, benign and playful, I would bring by to try to bring the conversation somewhere else other than, the obvious fact that they were not where they should be.
David Austin treated Asadullah and the other boys as traumatized children and focused on rehabilitating them.
They were in shock. They had obvious signs of what I would consider PTSD. I didn't know to what degree that was from, just the trip or from the experience they had had prior to being picked up. I remember them not speaking, not making eye contact, and I think they were scared.
We've only been dealing with these people for a week.
Al Shimkis was one of the commanding officers and had to deal with some of the biggest controversies at Guantanamo, like waterboarding and hunger strikes. But he admits one of his toughest dilemmas was handling Asadullah and the other boys. He was David Austin's boss and tried his best to help.
We learned that, at least from the context of our understanding, he was sexually abused. And so that's when I felt that I made the right choice by bringing a psychologist in. The psychologist was able to support him, at least initially, in dealing with the sexual trauma that may have occurred before coming to Guantanamo.
But at least some people in military command still considered Asadullah a terrorist with potential intelligence value, not simply a damaged child. These two views of him, both coming from people who were in charge of him, are difficult for me to reconcile. John Venata was head of security at Guantanamo Bay at the same time, and very close to the commanding general.
Were these kids considered terrorists, the same as the other prisoners in Guantanamo Bay?
When they were taken off the battlefield, I'm sure they were classified as terrorists at that point till they were sent to Guantanamo Bay. Once they were in Guantanamo Bay, they were treated very differently than any other detainees there, and they were recognized as, young men.
For the American military, this was all uncharted territory. Asadullah was still in a military prison, and he says frequently interrogated.
تا چې شي کول هلته ولې ونیولې په څه باندې ونیولې تا څه کار کاوه ته د دغه قومانده ته د سمود سره د کار کاوه تا بل څه کار ته بل څه وظیفه کوله بیا به په ما باندې نقشې اچولې قصه خو ډیره درازه قصه ده نو په ما به نقشې اچولې ته د خپل کور او نقشې واچوه موږ ته دا د پلاني خلکو د پلاني مسیرانو د دغو د کورونو په نښه کوه دا د چا کور ده.
I asked the State Department why Asadullah was questioned. What could the CIA possibly hope to learn from a young Afghan house servant, the victim of sexual abuse? Nobody would talk to me. The one person who will speak to me is James Yee, a Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo Bay at the time. I tracked him down in a New Jersey suburb.
Hi, Captain.
Hi.
How are you?
How are
I'm
you?
Sonia from Mountain.
Good. Come on in.
Thank you.
I did hear of some of the tactics, the dangling carrot stick tactics that they used with the juvenile detainees at Guantanamo, and I saw the result of Asadullah and the others being very upset, being very frustrated, being withdrawn following these types of interrogation sessions.
Others deny the interrogations ever even took place.
The thing that General Miller came out with was he did not want them interrogated or questioned, so anybody assigned to be with them were not to ask them any questions about their role in the combat situation. There was never, and under General Miller's instruction, there was never any effort even to covertly try to extract information, because if one of the soldiers would have even brought some information, listen to what I found out, that soldier would have been in trouble because they were under strict orders not to do it.
If that's true, what was the point of them being there in the first place? And why keep them there for so long?
There's no way that these kids know anything of any importance that, will impact anyone else. It was my feeling that these kids were very simple. They had, not very complex lives, and to mastermind or to come up with any type of significant threat to anyone was probably fairly unlikely.
For Asadullah, prison was beginning to take a toll.
هر ساعت به مې یادېده، بیا خصوصا مور او پلار، بیا د ما یو وړوکی ورور دا به مې ډېر یادېده. نو بس یادېده به مې ډېر چې کله به مې په خوب ولیده نو هغه ورځ به بیا په ما باندې یو ماتم و. ډېر سخت زور به یې راکاوه. بس د هغه تشویشونو خفګان له امله اوسې ناڅاپي تکلیف راولید هغلته. ډېر سخت زوبل شوم، ډېر سخت مریضي مې تېره کړه. نو بس تا هغه 8 میاشتې 9 میاشتې ما به د اعصابو د دوا خوړله. د دې له لاسه چې د ما کور ډېر یادېده. خامخا نو مور او پلار په دومره عمر کې څوک پرېږدي نه یادېږي.
At Camp Iguana, the boys' rehabilitation continued. David Austin began to notice small changes in Asadullah and the other two boys. Progress. He felt he was making a positive difference in their lives.
I think Asadullah probably responded the best out of the three. He was the quickest to pick up on kind of the educational aspects and the things that were offered. I would estimate that over a short period of time, he picked up English and was able to communicate, at least with me, in a rudimentary way.
American commanders seemed to use Asadullah's progress as a pretext for keeping him there, but it seems to me that they just couldn't find a better alternative.
I cannot answer why they were there that long, except that knowing that if they were returned, they could end up back on the battlefield and end up being killed. So returning them early would not have been a favor to them if they were going to be released right back and end up right back in a combat situation. So part of it was consideration to them. Part of it was that we really, except for making reports that went higher up, we did not have the final say of when somebody was going to be released from Guantanamo Bay.
By 2004, prisoners were starting to be released. Asadullah's fate was being decided behind closed doors in the U.S.
From the beginning, the Pentagon acknowledged that they needed to figure out a process to both set up some rehabilitation kinds of standard or context for them while they're at Guantanamo, and also to arrange for their return to Afghanistan.
What I'm discovering is that people in authority all had very different views of what should be done with the boys. Some thought they should be kept in Guantanamo Bay, almost for their own protection. Others thought they should be flown back to Afghanistan, back to their families.
They didn't belong in Guantanamo Bay. We're not in the business of detaining children. We, not knowing how long, because the repatriation had not begun to occur, but it was my recommendation to the general that they be repatriated as soon as possible. They didn't belong in Guantanamo.
Yet they were there for a year and a half.
They were. And I think that's our bureaucracy and our diplomatic, conundrum sometimes, and how is this going to occur?
just as this nightmare started for Asadullah, it ended. With no justification, no statement, no explanation.
نه پیدلم وګاو ما به اکثره وخت له ما سره د عسکرو سره به مې ډېر ګپ لګاوه ډېر به مې ورته ویلي چې موږ څه وخت خوسې کېږو خو هغو ما ته نه ویلې بس یو ورځ چې ګوره ما د تحقیق والا تک توردسي خو نوم یې و یو کتاب یې د موږ په اړه لیکلی ده هغه راغی چې ګورم بس راغی عسکر یې ټول وایستل اتې دی موږ سره تناس وایي موږ ته زیری راکوي زیری در باندې کوم مال د څه شي زیری را باندې کوي وایي یو خوشخبري ښه خبر مې درته راوړې ده اتې موږ ورته ویلو چې بس څه شی غواړې دلته جوس کیله دا شیان لرو نور خو موږ پیسې میسې منې نشته اتې راته ویلې بس صحیح ده درته وایم خو ډېرې وځورول اخر راته ویلې بس تاسې د پلانې یکشنبې ورځ وه څو شنبې ورځ وه تاسې 5 ورځې بعد خوشي کېږئ خلاصېږئ.
Asadullah and the other 2 boys were flown back to Afghanistan, back with their families. But any happiness was short-lived. He felt like a stranger in his own country, in his own village, where the Taliban had grown more powerful.
هغه خو کله چې اسدالله بیرته راغی په اول کې خو ټول خلک خوشحاله وو که نه خو بعض هلته منفي فکر دا و چې دا د امریکایانو وړی و دا هلته کېدای چې دا یې امریکایانو ذهن یې اړولی دی ماشوم ده که نه کېدای ذهن یې اړولی امریکایانو طرف ته.
To me, Asadullah's story has always been one of a lost childhood, of lost innocence, of years spent in a prison for a crime he didn't commit. And it's difficult for him to come to terms with his past, even though so many years have gone by. He's kept every letter, every scrap of paper from those days, everything seared into his memory.
I congratulate you for your eye-catching progress. You remember the day when you disappointedly told me that you cannot read and write. Thank God now you can read and write desirably. Make sure to continue your education no matter where you are, because if you don't use, you will lose it. With all my best wishes, your teacher.
Also in these papers is the document that was supposed to exonerate him, to pave his way back to a normal life in Afghanistan.
There's a letter here from the Department of Defense, which is dated 29th January 2004, which is when you were released. And it says your name here, Asadullah.
Yes.
And here it says, this individual has been determined to pose no threat to the United States Armed Forces or its interests in Afghanistan.
But here, in Afghanistan, this means nothing. In many ways, it's a curse.
Well, if you're coming back from detention with the Americans, there will be a lot of questions. People want to know, why were you put in prison in the first place? But also, why were you let go? There's a lot of suspicion about, were you cooperating with the Americans? What did you say during your time in detention? These people end up in a kind of limbo, caught between worlds.
Like tens of thousands of Afghans, Asadullah fled his village because the Taliban has taken control of the entire area. Today, Kabul is teeming with people just like him. A generation of Afghans struggling to find work, a place to live, all in the shadow of violence. For Asadullah, it's even worse. He found himself on a Taliban hit list after he refused to join them.
دلیل دا ده لاوله مې دغه سوچ کاوه چې ودر یو زندگی جوړه کړو یو کاروبار یو آینده ولرو له توپک نه څه نه خیزي ډاز او ډوز دا وله اخر خپله کې مړ سي دغسې ولاړ سي مور او پلار کور ټول پاتې سي.
The 2 boys he was with in Guantanamo Bay have joined the Taliban as fighters.
It doesn't surprise me at all that people who had been detained at Guantanamo were specifically targeted by the Taliban. we believe that that Guantanamo is one of the best recruitment tools that the U.S. could have handed to the Taliban and other armed groups. Having a former Guantanamo detainee as part of your armed group would certainly be, a feather in a cap for a lot of commanders.
The Taliban threatens Asadullah with text messages and phone calls. The other day, his close friend was shot dead in the street. He worries he's next.
په بد نظر ګوري حتی که دی اوس داسې خبر سي چې دی اوس له خارجیانو سره کته پورته کوي نو دا به بیخي ماته ډېر غټ تهدید له دې نه هم غټ تهدید سي.
But Asadullah is willing to take the risk because he hopes someone, somewhere, will listen and help him get the justice he deserves.
ته د ما عزت ته د ما هر څه ته تهدید ده هم یې هغو د ما عزت لوټ کړه ابرو مې لوټ کړه له خارجیانو هم دلته اوس د دوی نه خلاصېږم په دواړو کې ایتیا ایران ټوله زندګي م تباه سوه لاسې وسوځېده په اور کې.
I need to believe he still stands some kind of a chance. I can still see glimpses of the child I first met. A hint of happiness and hope in a country where very little exists. His life remains a battle for survival, one that started at a very young age. And today, he has little faith in his own future. He is still a prisoner of his own past.